the second most powerful man in Nazi Germany actually do all day? While historians have spent decades cataloguing the crimes of the Third Reich, very few have paused to ask a surprisingly revealing question about one of its most grotesque figures. Hermann Göring held more official titles than perhaps any single individual in modern European history. He was Commander-in-Chief of the Luftwaffe, Reichsmarschall of the Greater German Reich, Prime Minister of Prussia, President of the Reichstag, Plenipotentiary of the Four-Year Plan, Reich Master of the Hunt, and, at one point, Hitler's officially designated successor. He commanded a personal fortune plundered from the art collections of Europe, lived in a palace he had built from the ground up in a Brandenburg forest, and wore costumes so elaborate that even his own subordinates occasionally struggled to keep a straight face. And yet, by the middle of the war, there was a persistent whispered question echoing through the corridors of the German High Command, through diplomatic circles, and ultimately through the barracks of the Luftwaffe itself. What exactly was Hermann Göring doing? Not in the grand strategic sense, not in the historical ledger of his crimes, but literally, practically, on any given Tuesday in 1942. What filled his days? When did he rise? What did he eat? How did he conduct the war from behind the walls of his fairy tale estate, while the men of his air force froze to death on the Eastern Front? The answer, it turns out, is both more fascinating and more damning than almost anything his prosecutors said about him at Nuremberg. In this video, we're going to follow Hermann Göring through his daily life, from his first bleary, morphine-hazed mornings to his late-night theatrical performances at the dinner table, from his obsessive art-thieving expeditions to his catastrophic failures of military leadership. We will reveal the man behind the medals, the grotesque reality behind the grandiose uniform, and the extraordinary story of how one of the most powerful individuals in the world spent his time doing almost everything except winning the war. So, without further ado, let us begin. To understand a single day in the life of Hermann Wilhelm Göring, you first have to understand the extraordinary arc that brought him to the pinnacle of Nazi power, because nothing about his daily routine in the 1940s made any sense without the context of who he had been in the 1910s and 1920s. Hermann Göring was born on January 12, 1893 in Rosenheim, Bavaria, the fourth of 5 children of Heinrich Ernst Göring, a former colonial governor who had served the Wilhelmina German Empire in southwest Africa and Haiti. His mother, Franziska, had a more complicated story. She was involved in a long-running affair with a wealthy Nuremberg physician named Hermann Eppenstein, a man of partly Jewish ancestry who would become Göring's godfather and, in practical terms, his childhood patron. Eppenstein provided the Göring family with their primary residence, a medieval castle called Weldenstein, and another property called Mautendorf in Austria. Young Hermann grew up in these romantic, quasi-feudal surroundings, sleeping in actual castle chambers, roaming actual medieval battlements, and absorbing, whether consciously or not, a deep and lasting sense that splendor, power, and the accumulation of beautiful things were simply the natural entitlements of someone like himself. This childhood, more than almost anything else, explains the adult Göring. It explains Karinhall. It explains the stolen paintings. It explains the theatrical uniforms and the theatrical persona. It explains the way he always wanted more, grander, more gilded, more overwhelming. He had been raised, quite literally, in a castle, and some part of him never entirely left it. His father died when Hermann was still a child, and Eppenstein eventually ceased his support, forcing the family into more modest circumstances. But the impressions had already been made. Young Göring was a headstrong, rebellious child who was eventually sent to military cadet school, and it was there that he first discovered the thing that would define his early identity, the thing that would make him a genuine hero long before he became a villain. He had a talent for flying. During the First World War, Göring began his service in the infantry on the Western Front before transferring to the German Air Service, initially as an observer and then as a pilot. He proved to be genuinely skilled, courageous and aggressive in the air, and by the end of the war he had achieved 22 confirmed aerial victories and been awarded the Pour le Mérite, Germany's highest military decoration, commonly known as the Blue Max. More significantly, when Germany's most famous fighter pilot, Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron himself, was killed in April 1918, the command of his legendary squadron, Jagdgeschwader 1, eventually passed to Hermann Göring, It was one of the most prestigious commands in the entire German military, and Göring held it until the armistice. He was 25 years old, covered in medals, commanding elite pilots, and already developing the habits of theatrical self-presentation that would become his trademark. He told dramatic stories about his aerial combats. He cultivated his reputation with deliberate care. He understood, earlier than almost anyone around him, the power of personal mythology. The armistice hit Göring harder than it hit most German officers, not because of the defeat itself, but because of what it stripped away. In a matter of days, he went from commanding Germany's most celebrated fighter squadron to being a young veteran with no job, no clear future, and no outlet for the aggressive, acquisitive energy that defined him. He rattled around Europe for several years, briefly working as a stunt pilot in Sweden, where in 1920 he met and fell, passionately in love with Karin von Kantzow, a Swedish noblewoman of considerable beauty who was already married to someone else. The story of Karin and Hermann Göring is one of the stranger romantic subplots of the Third Reich. She left her husband for him. They married in 1922. He adored her with what appeared to be genuine, consuming passion, a devotion that would outlast even her death and would ultimately shape the most extravagant chapter of his post-war career. But before all of that, before Karinhall and the stolen masterpieces and the morphine, there was a beer hall in Munich and a movement that was about to change everything. Göring attended one of Adolf Hitler's speeches in Munich in 1921, and the effect was immediate and electric. Here was someone else who spoke the language of heroism and grievance and national rebirth that Göring himself had been nursing since 1918. He joined the Nazi Party in 1922 and was appointed commander of the SA, the Sturmabteilung, the brown-shirt paramilitary force that served as Hitler's street muscle. On November 8, 1923, Göring marched beside Hitler in the Beer Hall Putsch, the failed coup attempt in Munich that was supposed to spark a national revolution, but instead ended with scattered gunfire in the Odeonsplatz. Göring was shot in the groin and thigh and very nearly died. He was smuggled across the border into Austria for emergency treatment. The wounds were extremely painful and took months to heal, and it was during this period of agonizing recovery that Hermann Göring was first prescribed morphine. He would not be free of it for the rest of his life. This fact, this one wound and this one prescription in 1923 is perhaps more important to understanding what Göring did all day in 1942 and 1943 than any battlefield decision or strategic calculation. The morphine addiction colored everything. It affected his mood, his energy levels, his ability to make decisions under pressure, his weight, his perception of time. When people asked what Göring was doing on any given day, the honest answer, for large stretches of the 1930s and 1940s, was that he was managing, suppressing, feeding, or being managed by his dependency on opioids. After the failed putsch, Göring and Karin spent years in Swedish exile before the charges against him were eventually dropped under an amnesty. They returned to Germany in 1927. Karin's health had never been robust, and she suffered from tuberculosis and a serious heart condition. Hermann nursed her as best he could while rebuilding his political career in Germany, and when she died in October 1931, he was devastated in a way that surprised people who expected him to be made of tougher stuff. He was genuinely heartbroken. He kept her ashes in a special urn for years before eventually interring them in a mausoleum he built at Karinhall, the vast estate he would construct in the Schorfheide forest north of Berlin, and name in her honor. The grief seemed to intensify his other appetites, as grief sometimes does. He ate more, drank more, dressed more elaborately, wanted more of everything. And he threw himself back into politics with the kind of reckless, all-consuming energy that characterized everything he did. By 1932, Göring had been elected to the Reichstag and was serving as its president. By January 1933, when Hitler became Chancellor, Göring was one of only 3 NSDAP members in the cabinet, and he moved immediately and ruthlessly to consolidate power in Prussia, Germany's largest state. He created a secret state police force and handed it to his subordinates, the force that would become the Gestapo. He had 6,000 political opponents arrested in the weeks following Hitler's appointment. He orchestrated the use of the Reichstag fire of February 27, 1933, whether or not he was directly responsible for setting it, as a pretext for emergency decrees that effectively suspended civil liberties across Germany. He was 39 years old and moving at the speed of a man who sensed that the window of opportunity might not stay open forever. And then, once the power was consolidated, once the enemies were dealt with, once the Gestapo was running and the concentration camps were opening, Göring did something that surprised some of his contemporaries. He slowed down. Not entirely, not immediately, but gradually, and then with increasing momentum, he shifted from revolutionary to sybarite, from political operator to collector, from the hard-driving machine of 1933 to the increasingly decorative, increasingly indolent figure that the Wehrmacht and the Luftwaffe would have to deal with throughout the war years. Why? Partly it was the morphine, partly it was the satisfaction of having arrived, having achieved the power and magnificence he had always believed was his due. Partly, too, it was the nature of his new project, the Luftwaffe, which consumed him in ways that were both creative and self-indulgent. In 1935, Hitler publicly announced the existence of the German Air Force in direct violation of the Treaty of Versailles and appointed Göring its commander-in-chief. It was the role that would define and ultimately doom his legacy. And to understand how Göring spent his days from 1935 onward, you have to understand that for him, commanding the Luftwaffe was never primarily a military enterprise. It was a performance. It was an extension of the same theatrical impulse that made him change his uniform 6 times in a single day. It was a stage, and he was the lead actor, and the fact that real aeroplanes were falling out of real skies over real cities was, in some fundamental sense, secondary to the drama of it all. So what did a typical day look like for the Reichsmarschall at the height of his power? Let us start at the beginning, with the most basic question of all. When did Hermann Göring wake up? The answer, consistently reported by his staff, his adjutants, and the various officers who were unfortunate enough to have business with him in the mornings, was that he generally did not wake up before 10 o'clock in the morning. On some days, particularly in the later years of the war, when the morphine dosages were higher and the weight was heavier and the military situation was grimmer, it was closer to 11. On a few documented occasions when there was no pressing meeting or crisis, his household staff reported that he did not emerge from his private chambers until midday. This was not, it should be said, entirely unusual by the standards of the Nazi leadership. Hitler himself was famously nocturnal and rarely received visitors before noon, but for the commander of an air force in the middle of the most destructive air campaign in history, the habit of sleeping until mid-morning was, to put it mildly, a logistical complication. Generals waiting to brief him on the overnight operations found themselves cooling their heels in his anterooms, clutching reports about losses and sortie rates while the Reichsmarschall was still in his bedroom. Staff officers described the peculiar atmosphere of waiting in the corridors of Karinhall or the Air Ministry in Berlin. The soft sounds of the estate in the morning, the distant preparations in the kitchens, the absolute prohibition on any noise that might disturb his sleeping, the careful choreography required to be ready for him the instant he appeared without giving any impression of urgency that might irritate him. When Göring did finally emerge, the morning ritual was elaborate and time-consuming in ways that further delayed any actual work. He bathed at length and with meticulous attention. His bathroom facilities, both at Karinhall and at his other properties, were among the most lavishly appointed in Germany, fitted with deep Roman-style tubs and extensive collections of bath oils and perfumes, some of which he had ordered specially manufactured for him. His valet, Robert Kropp, who served him for most of the war years, would lay out the first uniform of the day, because there would be several. Göring's relationship with his uniforms is one of the most documented and most extraordinary aspects of his daily existence. He did not simply wear uniforms. He designed them, obsessed over them, and changed them with a frequency that bewildered the officers around him. On a single day at Karinhall, he might appear at breakfast in a creamy white military tunic of his own invention, change after the morning meeting into what one adjutant described as a sort of Renaissance hunter's outfit, complete with a large ornamental knife at his belt, appear at lunch in a different version of the Reichsmarschall's uniform with the distinctive baton, and then emerge for the evening dinner in something that was, by several accounts, more reminiscent of ancient Rome than 20th century Germany. A toga-like garment with jewelled clasps and an elaborate headdress that appeared to have no official designation in any military manual ever written. It was theatre, pure and unapologetic, and it reflected something genuine about how Göring understood himself. He was not merely a military commander, he was a historical figure, and historical figures, in his view, dressed accordingly. The breakfast itself was a production. Göring ate enormously throughout his life, and by the late 1930s and especially during the war years, his appetite had become legendary, and not in a flattering way. He ate multiple courses. He ate meats and pastries and rich German dishes in combinations and quantities that shocked visitors who were accustomed to wartime rationing. The irony of this was not lost on the German public, who were facing increasingly severe shortages of food and basic goods, while official propaganda celebrated the sacrifice and solidarity of the German people. Stories circulated, whispered at first and then more openly as the war went badly, about the Reichsmarschall's table and its abundant, almost obscene hospitality, while ordinary Germans thinned and shivered. His weight was a visible daily testimony to the gap between the leadership's lived experience and the reality of the war they had started. By 1943, Göring weighed somewhere in the region of 260 to 300 pounds, depending on whose account you trust. A transformation so dramatic from the lean, athletic fighter pilot of 1918 that photographs of the two periods barely seem to depict the same individual. His Luftwaffe subordinates, with the black humour common to military men in difficult circumstances, had a private nickname for him that was absolutely not used within his hearing. They called him Der Dicke, the Fat One. Some accounts suggest the nickname was so widespread that even Hitler occasionally used it, though presumably not with affection. After breakfast, the morning meeting. This was, in theory, the moment at which the business of running the Luftwaffe actually took place. In practice, the morning briefings at Karinhall were often more social than strategic. Göring would receive his chief of staff, his operations officers, and various adjutants, and they would present him with reports on the previous night's operations, current aircraft availability, production numbers, and whatever strategic questions required his attention. The difficulty was that Göring's attention was variable, his grasp of technical detail was unreliable, and his habit of making large, sweeping pronouncements based on what he felt to be true, rather than what the data actually indicated, was a standing source of despair for the professional officers around him. He had made one of the most consequential and catastrophic promises of the entire war, the promise to Hitler that the Luftwaffe could supply the surrounded Sixth Army at Stalingrad by air, based on what multiple accounts describe as an almost complete disregard for the logistical realities. His own staff were frantically trying to communicate to him. Albert Kesselring, one of the most capable and clear-eyed Luftwaffe commanders, later said in interviews that trying to brief Göring on complex operational matters was like trying to explain a chess problem to someone who kept insisting on playing drafts. The man understood the outlines of air power. He grasped the basics. He had genuine enthusiasm for aviation, genuine knowledge of the aircraft his designers were building, genuine passion for the Luftwaffe as a concept and as an institution. What he lacked was the discipline, the patience, and, increasingly, the sobriety to translate that enthusiasm into effective command decisions under pressure. The question of Göring's drug use is central to any honest account of how he spent his days, and it deserves more attention than it typically receives in popular histories. After his morphine dependency began following the 1923 putsch, he was treated for addiction on several occasions, most notably in 1925 when Karin, already aware of the problem, had him committed to Langbro Mental Hospital outside Stockholm. He was described in the hospital records as violent when denied his medication, and the treatment was only partially successful. Through the late 1920s and 1930s, he managed his dependency with varying degrees of control. By the time the war began in 1939, he had largely substituted the raw morphine of his early addiction for parakadine pills, a milder opioid that he consumed in extraordinary quantities. By 1943, multiple sources, including his personal physician and several of his adjutants, reported that he was taking as many as 40 to 100 parakadine pills per day. To put that in perspective, a standard therapeutic dose of similar medications today would be a small fraction of that figure. He carried the pills in a small leather case that went everywhere with him. His staff knew not to comment on it. His physician, Dr. Ondarza, who replaced the more cautious Dr. von Ondarza in the later war years, was reportedly far less restrictive about prescriptions, and the dosages climbed as the military situation deteriorated. The effect on his daily functioning was significant and cumulative. He was slower. He was more prone to distraction. He was more given to the kind of grand, disconnected optimism that ignored inconvenient evidence. And he slept, whenever he could manage it, the long, heavy sleep of someone whose body was permanently trying to compensate for what it was being given. The afternoons at Karinhall were the part of Göring's day that most dramatically illustrated the gap between his official responsibilities and his actual preoccupations. After the morning briefing, after perhaps 2 or 3 hours of paperwork or meetings or phone calls, the afternoon belonged to what he called his collections. This is where the story of Hermann Göring's daily life intersects with one of the great crimes of the Second World War, the systematic looting of European art on a scale that had not been seen since Napoleon. Göring's art collection, the one he assembled through a combination of forced purchase, outright theft, and the coercive machinery of occupation, was at the time of his arrest in 1945 estimated to contain somewhere between 1,300 and 1,500 individual works. These included paintings by Rembrandt, Vermeer, Van Dyck, Rubens, Titian, and dozens of other masters. They included medieval sculptures, tapestries, ancient Roman bronzes, Renaissance decorative objects, and entire interiors stripped from Jewish-owned homes and galleries across France, the Netherlands, Belgium, Poland, and the Soviet Union. He had an entire special unit working on his behalf, the Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, or ERR, which was theoretically Rosenberg's operation, but which Göring used extensively and with complete priority access to the best pieces. When the ERR finished cataloguing the contents of confiscated Jewish homes in Paris, Göring's representatives were usually first in line. He also personally conducted buying expeditions through occupied territories, using a combination of his official position and the simple fact of armed German occupation to negotiate prices that were, in the polite language of the post-war restitution commissions, not entirely voluntary. The collecting consumed his afternoons in a very literal sense. His staff maintained detailed inventories of the works stored at Karinhall, and Göring spent hours reviewing photographs and descriptions of new acquisitions, directing their placement in the estate's galleries, and planning future expeditions. He corresponded directly with dealers, curators, and representatives in occupied countries. He received regular visits from art experts whom he questioned with the focused, knowledgeable enthusiasm of a genuine connoisseur, because whatever else Göring was, he was not a careless or ignorant collector. He had studied art history with real seriousness, he had preferences and opinions, and he was genuinely capable of distinguishing between works of different quality and period. Several of the dealers who worked with him after the war noted, with uncomfortable admiration, that his eye was excellent. This made the theft more obscene, not less, because it was not the blundering pillage of an ignorant soldier, but the deliberate, informed, methodical accumulation of a man who knew exactly what he was taking and why it mattered. Karinhall itself was the physical expression of everything Göring wanted his daily life to be, and understanding it is essential to understanding him. He began building it in 1933 on a forested estate in the Schorfheide, a protected hunting area north of Berlin that had previously been reserved for the Hohenzollern royal family. The name was taken from his first wife, Karin, whose remains were eventually transferred there to a mausoleum in the woods. The estate grew over the years, extended and elaborated with each new infusion of money and stolen resources, until by the early 1940s it was essentially a private palace complex of extraordinary size and opulence. There was the main house, which had been expanded multiple times to accommodate Göring's growing art collection. There was a separate games room with billiard tables and model train sets that he played with in the evenings with something approaching genuine childlike joy. There was an elaborate indoor swimming pool. There were guest suites and staff quarters and a fully equipped cinema. There were garages containing dozens of motor vehicles. There were stables, there were kennels, there were aviaries containing exotic birds. The estate included its own airstrip, its own anti-aircraft installations, its own underground bunker complex. In the forests surrounding the main buildings, Göring had introduced herds of bison, moose, and various deer, species maintaining his own personal wildlife reserve in the Prussian woods. He was, remember, the Reich Master of the hunt, and he took this designation with total seriousness. Hunting was not merely a pastime for Göring, it was a fundamental expression of his self-image, the hunter as archetype, the man who moved through the natural world with authority and took what he chose. He hunted with medieval weapons as well as firearms. He kept a spear and various other antiquarian hunting implements as part of his theatrical arsenal. He invited senior officials, foreign dignitaries and military commanders to hunting parties at Karinhall that were famous throughout the German political world for their lavishness and for the slightly unsettling experience of spending a day in the Prussian forest with a 250-pound man dressed as a medieval Germanic chieftain carrying a hunting spear. The dinners at Karinhall were events unto themselves, and they occupied the evenings in ways that further illuminated the peculiar atmosphere of Göring's daily existence. He loved to entertain, and the guest lists at Karinhall across the late 1930s and throughout the war read like a who's who of the Third Reich, the diplomatic corps, the military high command, foreign dignitaries, and a rotating cast of artists, athletes, and celebrities whose presence gave the proceedings a quality that wavered uneasily between court entertainment and propaganda performance. Göring was, by universal account, a compelling host. He was funny, in the blunt, aggressive way of a man who had spent his formative years in military messes, and he was a gifted raconteur who could hold a table's attention for hours with stories from the First World War, embellished freely and told with the timing of a natural performer. He enjoyed these evenings with visible, unself-conscious pleasure. The food was exceptional. The wine was whatever the best available in occupied Europe happened to be. The conversation was loud and ranging and occasionally dangerously indiscreet, and Göring, presiding over all of it in his latest theatrical outfit, was in his element in a way that he never quite was when actually doing his job. What happened at these dinners tells us a great deal about how Göring understood his role in the Third Reich at its height. He did not behave like a man under wartime pressures. He behaved like a Renaissance prince receiving his court, and the court behaved accordingly, with deference, flattery, and the kind of careful self-censorship that characterizes conversations in the presence of very powerful, very unpredictable patrons. Foreign diplomats who attended these evenings often remarked afterward on the contrast between the apparent ease and luxury of the setting and the dark context in which it was embedded. The Italian Foreign Minister Galeazzo Ciano, who attended several such evenings and left extensive diaries, described Göring with a mixture of fascination and contempt that captured the essential paradox of the man. Ciano noted his genuine warmth and humour, his obvious intelligence, and his equally obvious unwillingness to let either quality be put to serious use when there was a good dinner and an appreciative audience to be had. He described Göring as a man who had invented the perfect environment for himself, an environment in which every material comfort was available, in which he was perpetually surrounded by people whose role was to admire and agree with him, and in which the actual conduct of the war was conducted at a comfortable and deniable distance. But there was another dimension to the evenings at Karinhall that the formal diplomatic descriptions tended to leave out: the model trains. Hermann Göring's model railway was not a private hobby kept discreetly in an attic. It was an installation that occupied an entire room of the main house, a room large enough to accommodate not merely a standard hobby layout, but a scale model recreation of an entire railway network, complete with miniature landscapes, tunnels, stations, switching yards, and dozens of locomotives that Göring had collected, and in some cases, designed himself. He played with this installation with the focused, unhurried absorption of a child on Christmas morning, operating the controls himself, rerouting trains, setting up elaborate scenarios of switching and scheduling, entirely oblivious to whatever else might be happening in the war. Senior officers waiting to discuss matters of urgency with the Reichsmarschall were occasionally told, with complete seriousness by his adjutants, that he was not to be disturbed because he was in the train room. The model railway was another version of the same impulse that drove the costumes and the art collection, and the hunting expeditions, the insistence on a world of perfect, controllable beauty that operated according to his preferences and reflected his taste and power. Real trains in wartime Germany ran late and were bombed and carried soldiers to their deaths on the Eastern Front. The model trains ran exactly when and where Göring decided they would run, and nobody died, and nothing went wrong that couldn't be fixed by reaching down and picking it up. It would be easy and in a sense satisfying to dismiss Göring as simply a buffoon, the fat, drug-addled dilettante who lounged about while the war went wrong, a comic figure whose vanity and indolence made him more a figure of ridicule than terror. But this would be a profound historical mistake, and doing justice to the complexity of his story requires confronting the periods during which he was genuinely formidable, genuinely dangerous, and genuinely effective as a political and military operator. The late 1930s in particular saw Göring operating at a level of strategic competence and focused ambition that contradicts the later caricature. He was the key figure in Germany's economic rearmament, presiding over the four-year plan from 1936 with an energy and ruthlessness that genuinely accelerated Germany's war preparations. He was a critical architect of the Anschluss with Austria in 1938, personally conducting telephone negotiations with the Austrian government while Hitler hesitated, pushing the process forward with the kind of hard-nosed political bullying he was very good at when sufficiently motivated. He played a central role in the Munich crisis of September 1938, the negotiations that handed the Sudetenland to Germany, positioning himself as a moderate voice for negotiated settlement while fully supporting Hitler's objectives. Neville Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister who returned from Munich waving his famous piece of paper, considered Göring the most approachable and trustworthy of the Nazi leadership, which says something damning either about Göring's skill as a performer or about Chamberlain's judgment, or perhaps about both. The early phases of the war reinforced this picture. The Luftwaffe performed brilliantly in Poland in September 1939, its dive bombers and fighters providing the close air support that made blitzkrieg so devastating, and Göring, though he had little to do with the tactical execution, basked in the reflected glory with characteristic enthusiasm. The campaign in France and the Low Countries in May and June 1940 was even more spectacular. The Luftwaffe cutting through Allied air forces and terrifying enemy ground troops and civilians with the effectiveness that seemed to justify everything Göring had promised when he built the service from scratch in 1935. On June 19, 1940, the day after France requested an armistice, Göring received from Hitler perhaps the greatest honour of his career, promotion to the newly created rank of Reichsmarschall des Großdeutschen Reiches, the Reichsmarschall of the Greater German Reich, a rank specifically invented for him and one that placed him formally above every other military officer in Germany. He was given a specially designed baton to go with it, the Reichsmarschall stab, a gilded weapon of almost comic splendour encrusted with platinum eagles and iron crosses, which he carried with evident satisfaction for the remainder of the war, including at Nuremberg, where the prosecution had the distinct experience of watching a man accused of crimes against humanity fondling a jewelled baton during the proceedings. At the moment of his promotion, Göring was arguably the second most powerful person in the German Reich, and possibly, given the extent of the Luftwaffe's contribution to Germany's string of victories, the most celebrated military figure in the country apart from Hitler himself. Then came Britain. Then came the Battle of Britain, and with it, the beginning of the long unravelling that would eventually leave Göring discredited, isolated, and facing death in a Nuremberg courtroom. The story of the Battle of Britain is well known in its broad outlines. The RAF's fighter. Command, outnumbered and under immense pressure, holding on through the summer and autumn of 1940, while the Luftwaffe attempted to achieve the air superiority that would be necessary for a German invasion of England. What is less commonly discussed is the degree to which Göring's personal command decisions, made from his private train and from Karinhall and from various forward headquarters along the Channel coast that he visited with decreasing frequency as the autumn wore on, directly contributed to the Luftwaffe's failure to win the battle. His decision in late August 1940 to shift the main focus of German bombing attacks from RAF airfields and radar stations, which were being genuinely degraded, to London itself was perhaps the single most consequential command decision of the entire battle. It came partly from Hitler's desire to retaliate for a British attack on Berlin, partly from Göring's own conviction that bombing London would force the British to commit their remaining fighters to the defence of the capital, destroying them in the resulting battles. What it actually did was give Fighter Command a desperately needed pause in the attacks on its infrastructure and allow the RAF to begin recovering and rebuilding. The RAF was closer to collapse in late August 1940 than most people at the time realised, and Göring's decision to shift targets may well have saved it. This was not, it goes without saying, Göring's intention. His decisions during the battle were also shaped by his relationship with his fighter pilots and their commanders, and here too, the personal dynamics of his daily existence played a direct role in military outcomes. Göring was deeply frustrated by what he perceived as the excessive caution of his fighter commanders, and during a famous meeting with his senior pilots on August 19, 1940, He harangued them for not doing more, for not being aggressive enough, for leaving his bombers inadequately protected. He asked one of his finest fighter aces, Adolf Galland, who would later become one of the Luftwaffe's most distinguished commanders, what he needed to improve the situation. Galland replied with the directness that characterized the best of Germany's fighter pilots that he needed a squadron of Spitfires. Göring's response to this answer is not recorded in terms that would be suitable for a family-friendly YouTube channel. He was furious. He found the implication that British aircraft were superior to German ones, both personally insulting and strategically inconvenient. He was not interested in information that complicated his preferred narrative. He never really had been. By September 1940, it was clear that the Luftwaffe was not going to achieve the air superiority necessary for Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain. By October, the invasion had been indefinitely postponed. By the end of the year, the Battle of Britain was effectively over and the Luftwaffe had lost it. The Battle of Vie. Britain was a turning point in Göring's relationship with Hitler and therefore in his daily life and his sense of himself. Before the battle, he had been Hitler's favourite, his most publicly celebrated lieutenant, the embodiment of the new Germany's military dynamism. After the battle, something shifted. Hitler's confidence in him was shaken, though never quite broken until the very end of the war. The easy camaraderie of the early years became more strained, more conditional. Göring sensed the shift and responded to it in characteristic fashion, by retreating further into the comforts of Karinhall, by intensifying his art collecting, by building new rooms and acquiring new masterpieces, and staging even more elaborate dinner parties, as if the accumulation of splendour could compensate for the erosion of trust. He still attended Hitler's military conferences. He still held his titles and commanded his forces on paper. But the real operational decisions increasingly moved to other hands, to Milch, to Galland, to Kesselring, while Göring retained the ceremonial role and the baton and the increasingly unconvincing pretense of command. Let us spend a moment on the matter of Göring and the Holocaust, because no account of how he spent his days can be complete without confronting the specific ways in which the machinery of mass murder intersected with his daily operations, his signature, and his deliberate choices. Göring was not one of the primary architects of the final solution in the way that Himmler and Heydrich were, but he was by no means an innocent bystander, and two documents in particular place him in direct involvement. The first is the authorization he gave Hermann Heydrich on July 31, 1941, a single page that he signed and that directed Heydrich to undertake, in Göring's capacity as chairman of the Ministerial Council for the Defense of the Reich, all necessary preparations for a total solution of the Jewish question in the European sphere of German influence. This document, produced at Nuremberg as Exhibit USA 509, was one of the most damning pieces of evidence in the entire trial. Göring's defense was that the word translated as solution was ambiguous, that he had not intended murder, that he was referring to emigration and resettlement policies. The prosecution's response was that by July 1941, more than a year into the war and more than 2 years after the start of systematic persecution, any senior Nazi official who claimed not to understand what total solution meant was either lying or had made a deliberate choice not to know. The tribunal found the latter interpretation unpersuasive. The second document was the declaration of his as Nazi war criminal at Nuremberg. He was charged on all 4 counts: conspiracy to wage aggressive war, waging aggressive war, war crimes, and crimes against humanity, and found guilty on all 4. But for much of 1941 and 1942, when these decisions were being made and these orders were being signed, Göring's days continued in their established rhythm. The late mornings, the elaborate breakfasts, the brief, distracted briefings, the long, art-filled afternoons, the theatrical evenings at Karinhall. The war was happening out there, somewhere beyond the manicured gardens and the private forest with its bison and moose. The reports came in and were noted or ignored depending on Göring's mood and the paracodine count. The stolen paintings continued to arrive and were catalogued and hung. The model trains continued to run on their perfect miniature schedules. And slowly, month by month, the gap between the world Göring had constructed for himself and the world that was actually unfolding grew wider and more impossible to bridge. The year 1942 brought the Eastern Front to a crisis that would prove fatal not only to hundreds of thousands of soldiers, but to whatever remained of Göring's military credibility. Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union, launched on June 22, 1941, had initially seemed to vindicate the Luftwaffe's offensive doctrine. German aircraft destroyed thousands of Soviet planes in the first days of the campaign, many of them still on the ground, and provided the close air support that made the Wehrmacht's dramatic advances possible. Göring was enthusiastic, ebullient, visiting his forward headquarters with uncharacteristic frequency in the early weeks, making speeches about the swift destruction of Soviet resistance. But as autumn turned to winter and the Wehrmacht's advance stalled in front of Moscow, and as the Soviet Air Force, written off in the first weeks as essentially destroyed, continued to produce and fly aircraft in numbers that German intelligence had not anticipated, the picture became more complicated. Göring's response to complexity, predictably, was to become more confident and more dismissive of inconvenient data, not less. The catastrophe of Stalingrad took shape through the autumn of 1942, as Field Marshal Paulus's Sixth Army was enveloped by the Soviet counteroffensive Operation Uranus and cut off in the destroyed city on the Volga. Hitler asked whether the Luftwaffe could supply the trapped army by air. The calculation was brutal and simple. The Sixth Army required a minimum of 300 tons of supplies per day to survive and continue fighting, and the Luftwaffe's available transport capacity, accounting for weather, losses and operational limitations, could realistically deliver perhaps 100 tons per day, and that optimistically. Göring, presented with these numbers by his own logistics staff, made the promise anyway. He told Hitler the Luftwaffe could do it. Multiple accounts from Milch, from Zeitzler, from other officers present at the conferences where this decision was made, describe Göring's certainty as something beyond confidence and approaching derangement, an absolute refusal to accept the arithmetic. Some have attributed this to the morphine, others to vanity, the need to not be seen to fail in front of Hitler, others simply to the long-established habit of asserting what he wished to be true and expecting reality to comply. Whatever the cause, the promise was made. The Luftwaffe tried. On its best days, at the beginning of the airlift, it delivered perhaps 140 tons to the pocket. As Soviet anti-aircraft defences strengthened and winter weather worsened, the daily deliveries fell to 60, 40, 30 tons. Men of the Sixth Army starved and froze. Paulus surrendered on February 2, 1943. More than 200,000 German soldiers were taken prisoner. Hitler was white with fury. And Göring, who had made the promise that could not be kept, had reached the point of no return in his relationship with the Führer he had served for 20 years. In the aftermath of Stalingrad, the question of what Hermann Göring actually did all day became, for the first time, genuinely pressing to people outside his immediate circle. Before Stalingrad, his indolence was an open secret, tolerated in the way that powerful men's eccentricities are always tolerated when they are winning. After Stalingrad, it became a political and military liability of the first order. The Luftwaffe had failed to supply the Sixth Army. The Luftwaffe's fighter forces were increasingly struggling against both the RAF over Germany and the expanding Soviet Air Force on the Eastern Front. Allied bombing raids on German cities were intensifying, and the Luftwaffe's ability to intercept them was declining. Each of these failures had specific technical and operational causes that a more engaged commander might have addressed more effectively, but all of them were ultimately symptoms of the same underlying problem, that the man nominally in charge of Germany's Air Force was not, in any meaningful operational sense, actually in charge of it. The bombing of German cities was the dimension of Göring's failure that most directly affected the German civilian population, and therefore the dimension that most directly affected his public standing. When Germany's cities first came under serious Allied air attack, Göring had made another of his famous impossible promises. He told the German public in effect that no enemy aircraft would ever fly over German territory. He later refined this to say that if an Allied bomber ever reached Hamburg, his name was Meyer, a Jewish surname chosen presumably for ironic purposes that was now, in the grim humour of the German home front, causing him enormous embarrassment. After the RAF's successful 1,000-bomber raid on Cologne in May 1942, after the firebombing of Hamburg in Operation Gomorrah in July 1943, after the devastating raids on industrial targets in the Ruhr, ordinary Germans had begun calling him Meyer, the alternative spelling of the surname, loudly and in public. The Gestapo's regular reports on public morale, the so-called Stimmungsberichte, recorded with increasing frequency that the Reichsmarschall was a subject of popular contempt, that his personal reputation had cratered, that jokes about his obesity and his costumes and his failure to protect German cities were circulating openly in ways that would have been unthinkable in 1940. The man who had been the celebrated hero of the Luftwaffe, the paladin of German air power, had become in the eyes of many German citizens the overweight symbol of broken promises and aristocratic excess. How did Göring himself respond to this deterioration? The answer tells us a great deal about his psychology and about the way power had shaped him over 2 decades. He did not fundamentally change his behaviour. He did not throw himself back into his work with renewed focus. He did not become more accessible to his subordinates, more attentive to their concerns, more willing to hear difficult truths. Instead, he retreated further. He spent more time at Karinhall and at his other properties, the Berghof, at Obersalzberg, the villa at Weldenstein, where he had spent part of his childhood, the various other residences he maintained across the Reich. He travelled increasingly by his private train, a luxury composition of carriages that included sleeping quarters, a dining car, a conference room and a bathroom, and which bore the somewhat grandiose name Asia. When Göring travelled by train, the train's schedule, like everything else in his orbit, revolved around his preferences rather than military necessity. It would stop for hours in scenic locations while he walked or hunted or simply sat in his personal carriage looking at his latest art acquisitions. Staff officers who needed him for urgent decisions sometimes found themselves waiting on platforms in the middle of the German countryside, while the Reichsmarschall contemplated a Flemish landscape painting that had recently arrived from France. His relationship with Hitler in the years from 1943 onward was a slow, painful, and for Göring profoundly disorienting dissolution. The two men had known each other since 1922. Hitler had been best man at Göring's second wedding to Emmy Sonnemann, the actress, in 1935, a ceremony of almost incomprehensible Nazi pomp that had transformed Berlin into a temporary stage set for their nuptials. Emmy was, by most accounts, a genuinely warm and decent woman who loved Göring with a simplicity and devotion that contrasted sharply with the Baroque world he inhabited, and his daughter Edda, born in 1938 through what the official propaganda presented as miraculous medical intervention, was, by all accounts, the only person whose claims on him were entirely uncomplicated by politics, ambition, or fear. He adored her with the uncomplicated tenderness he had once shown Karin. He played with her in the gardens at Karinhall. He brought her extravagant presents. He kept her photograph on his desk. She was, in the most genuine sense, the one pure thing in a life otherwise saturated, with moral complexity and physical excess, and it is worth noting that his daughter Edda Göring would spend much of her own life, as the Children of Nazi Leaders video from Nextlev described, attempting to live quietly, rarely speaking publicly about her father, maintaining in private that he was a good man while the world around her comprehensively disagreed. For Hitler, the relationship with Göring was evolving into something that maintained its formal structure while hollowing out from within. Hitler still received Göring at his headquarters, still consulted him, still retained him in his nominal position. But the easy confidence of the pre-war years, when Göring had been genuinely one of Hitler's closest and most trusted companions, was gone. In its place was a kind of wary courtesy, punctuated by occasional eruptions of Hitlerian fury when the Luftwaffe failed yet again to do what Göring had promised it could do. The other figures in Hitler's inner circle, Goebbels, Bormann, the increasingly powerful Martin Bormann, who controlled access to Hitler and used that control with ruthless skill, pressed the advantage whenever they could. Bormann in particular worked systematically to undermine Göring's standing, feeding Hitler with accounts of Göring's laziness, his drug use, his absences, his indifference to the war. Some of these accounts were entirely accurate. Some were exaggerated. Some were invented. Bormann was not a man who let the truth get in the way of a useful story. But the soil was fertile, and the seeds grew. The year 1943 also saw a significant and revealing development in Göring's art collecting operation, one that illustrates how his daily preoccupations continued to diverge from his official responsibilities, even as the strategic situation grew more desperate. In August 1944, as the Allied armies advanced across France following the D-Day landings of June 6th, Göring ordered a massive emergency shipment of his art collection from Paris, where many of the stolen works had been stored, to Karinhall. The operation involved dozens of railway cars and hundreds of staff members, and it proceeded with the kind of precise logistical efficiency that the Luftwaffe, ironically, had rarely managed to demonstrate in its actual military operations. Göring supervised the packing lists personally, dictating by telephone from Karinhall which works should be given priority, which should be wrapped first, how they should be arranged in the railway cars. The juxtaposition was not lost on those around him. The Wehrmacht was retreating across France. The Luftwaffe was struggling to maintain air cover over German cities. Allied bombers were reducing major industrial centres to rubble. And the Reichsmarschall was on the telephone discussing the packing protocols for his Renoir collection. By 1944, the daily rhythm at Karinhall had acquired a quality of theatrical unreality that several of Göring's staff would later describe in their memoirs and post-war interviews. The estate was still magnificent, still lavishly staffed, still producing its elaborate meals and its theatrical evenings. The art still hung on the walls, the model trains still ran, the animals in the private wildlife reserve still moved through the forests. But around the edges of this preserved paradise, the war was closing in. Perceptible in the sound of distant bombing raids, in the anxious faces of the staff, in the increasingly haggard and harried demeanour of the Luftwaffe officers who came to brief him and left shaking their heads. Göring himself seemed, to many observers, to exist in a kind of bubble, moving through his days with the focused concentration of a man who had decided that if he maintained the routines with sufficient precision, the external world could be kept at bay. He rose late. He bathed. He chose his costume for the morning. He ate his elaborate breakfast. He received his reluctant briefing. He spent his afternoon with the art or the hunt or the trains. He presided over his dinner. He took his pills and went to bed, and rose late again the next morning. It was a daily performance of normality in circumstances that were anything but normal, and it required, one suspects, a considerable act of will to maintain. There was one area, and perhaps only one, in which Göring's daily engagement remained genuinely technical and genuinely informed throughout much of the war, and that was aircraft development. Whatever his failures as a strategic commander and an operational administrator, Göring retained throughout the conflict a genuine enthusiasm for and knowledge of aviation technology, and his interventions in the German aircraft development process, while sometimes counterproductive, were at least engaged and informed. He was fascinated by the jet age that was clearly coming, intrigued by the Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter, and enthusiastic about its potential. His famous and catastrophically consequential intervention in the Me-262 program, when he appears to have supported or at least failed to oppose Hitler's insistence that the aircraft be developed as a bomber rather than a fighter, delaying its introduction in its most effective role by many months, was one of his worst decisions of the war. But it was at least a decision he made from knowledge rather than ignorance. He knew what the aircraft could do. He understood the technology. He had read the test reports. His failure here was not ignorance, but something worse, the characteristic Göring failure of allowing his political relationship with Hitler to override his better technical judgment. He also retained a genuine, if increasingly unfocused, interest in the Luftwaffe's fighter force and its personnel. He liked fighter pilots in the way that only a former fighter pilot truly can, with the fraternal recognition of a shared and dangerous craft, and some of his best moments as a commander came in his interactions with aces and squadron leaders whom he received with warmth and spoke with directly and honestly in ways that his dealings with senior staff rarely allowed. Adolf Galland, who had a complex and often adversarial relationship with Göring, nevertheless described moments of genuine connection, conversations about tactics and aircraft and the nature of air combat that cut through the pomp and ceremony and touched something real. Galland also described the frustration of watching that genuine knowledge and interest consistently subverted by Göring's vanity, his need to be right, his inability to accept professional disagreement. When Galland's pilots reported that American P-51 Mustangs were appearing as escort fighters over Germany in the winter of 1943 to 1944, their range far exceeding what German intelligence had believed possible, Göring refused to accept it. American fighters, he informed Galland with absolute certainty, could not have that range. When Galland insisted they could and had, Göring told him that German pilots who reported American long-range escorts over Germany were suffering from hallucinations. This exchange, one of the most notorious in the history of the German air war, was not a joke. It was a symptom of a command culture in which the man at the top had long since decided that facts were something he could choose to accept or reject based on how they made him feel. His relationship with Emmy and Edda provided, amid all of this, moments of something approaching genuine humanity. Emmy was never a political figure in any active sense, unlike several of the other Nazi wives whose lives we have examined in other videos. She had come to Göring's world from the world of the theatre, where she had been a respected actress, and she maintained throughout the war a kind of natural dignity that somehow survived the grotesque circumstances of her marriage. She managed the domestic life at Karinhall with competence and quiet grace. She kept the household running, managed the staff, received guests with the warmth that her husband deployed more theatrically and less sustainably. Edda, growing up in this opulent, bizarre, and historically doomed world, was given every material advantage and was raised with genuine affection. Her father took her to the model railway room and let her operate the switches. He took her on walks through the forest of the estate. He read to her. He was, within the bubble of Karinhall, something approximating a real father, and this coexistence of genuine familial love with the systematic criminal enterprise he was simultaneously conducting is one of the most disturbing aspects of the story, because it reveals not the monster of popular imagination, but something more uncomfortable. A recognizable human being who had made choices that led him to monstrous places while continuing to maintain within his private world the ordinary emotional furniture of a normal life. As 1944 gave way to 1945 and the Allied armies closed in from west and east, the daily rhythms at Karinhall began to break down under pressures that even Göring's extraordinary capacity for denial could not entirely manage. The bombing raids on Berlin were increasingly frequent and increasingly devastating, and the sound of air raid sirens became a constant feature of life in the capital. Karinhall, located in the Schorfheide north of Berlin, was relatively protected, but the proximity of the war was undeniable. Staff began to discuss evacuation. Göring's art collection became a preoccupation of a different kind, not the joyful acquisition of the earlier years, but the desperate logistical problem of how to move hundreds of masterpieces to safety before either the bombs or the advancing Red Army reached them. He ordered the works crated and prepared for transport. He arranged for the most valuable pieces to be moved to salt mines and other protected storage locations. He spent days personally supervising the packing operation, which his staff conducted with the kind of focused efficiency that had once made Germany's military machines so formidable, now redirected entirely to the preservation of stolen art. In the early months of 1945, Göring's daily existence had contracted from the Baroque magnificence of the Karinhall years to something much more desperate and much less coherent. He was, by this point, a man whose drug dependency was at its worst, whose physical condition was at its most debilitating, and whose political position was collapsing as rapidly as the military situation on all fronts. He was present at Hitler's headquarters less frequently, and when he was present, the atmosphere was charged with an animosity that both men were increasingly unable to conceal. Hitler blamed the Luftwaffe for every reverse, and the Luftwaffe's failures had become too numerous and too catastrophic to explain away. Göring, for his part, knew that he was being outmaneuvered politically by Bormann and others and was powerless to stop it, because the currency of influence in Hitler's inner circle was proximity and access, and Göring was increasingly absent from both. He was at Karinhall or on his train or at one of his other estates, surrounded by his art and his staff and his animals and his drugs, while the men who wanted his place were in the bunker with Hitler, whispering in his ear every day. The last great drama of Göring's Nazi career played out in April 1945 with the logic of a Greek tragedy, in which the character's defining flaw, the combination of vanity, ambition, and catastrophically bad political judgment, produced its inevitable catastrophe. As Hitler retreated into the Führerbunker in Berlin and Soviet forces tightened the ring around the capital, Göring departed from Berlin on April 20th, Hitler's birthday, for his retreat at Obersalzberg in Bavaria. With him went his wife, his daughter Edda, enormous quantities of art, and the entire household establishment of a man who had never quite grasped that the privileges of his position were contingent on the system that had granted them remaining functional. From Obersalzberg on April 23, 1945, Göring sent Hitler a telegram. It was one of the most ill-judged communications of the entire Third Reich, remarkable in a competition that included some genuinely catastrophic examples of misjudgment. There is a dimension of Göring's daily life in the war years that we have not yet examined with sufficient care, and that is the specific way he experienced and responded to the news of German military losses, because his reaction to bad news was itself a revealing and consequential aspect of his command style. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, who served as the head of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht throughout the war, and who therefore had to manage the interface between Hitler's headquarters and the operational commands, described in his post-war testimony the extraordinary difficulty of bringing negative assessments to Hitler's inner circle. With Hitler himself, the dynamic was one of fear, the fear of the Führer's volcanic rages and the real consequences they could have for careers and even lives. With Göring, the dynamic was different but equally obstructive. Göring did not rage in the Hitlerian manner when confronted with bad news. He denied it. He questioned its sources. He proposed alternative interpretations. He attacked the credibility of the officers bringing the report. He found ways to contextualize the information that transformed catastrophic failures into temporary setbacks attributable to the shortcomings of others. This pattern of denial was not, it should be emphasized, entirely irrational. It was, in a deeply dysfunctional way, adaptive, because in Hitler's court, the officer who reported failure and accepted responsibility for it was in a far more dangerous position than the officer who explained the failure as someone else's fault and maintained the confident posture of a man who would shortly set it right. Göring had survived 20 years in the Nazi hierarchy, partly by mastering this particular kind of political judo, the transformation of criticism into accusation, the redirection of blame downward or sideways, the maintenance of apparent confidence regardless of underlying reality. But a technique that worked brilliantly in the political infighting of the early Nazi years became catastrophic when applied to the conduct of an actual war, because wars eventually produce facts too large and too undeniable to redirect or reframe. Stalingrad was such a fact. The growing Allied bombing offensive was such a fact. The appearance of American P-51 Mustangs over Berlin in March 1944, escorting the daylight bombing raids that Göring had insisted were impossible, was such a fact, one that even he could not deny, though the denial lasted longer than any rational man would have thought possible. His relationship with reality was, in the deepest sense, the central problem of his career and his life. He had constructed, over decades, an environment designed to maintain the greatest possible distance between himself and uncomfortable truths. Karinhall was that environment made physical, a world of beauty and abundance and carefully controlled social dynamics where he was always right, always admired, always the most powerful and knowledgeable person in the room. The model railway was that control made literal and miniature, a world that ran exactly as its operator decreed. The art collection was that ideal made visible and permanent, beautiful things gathered from across Europe and arranged according to his taste and will. Even the theatrical costumes were a form of reality control, the creation of an external image so overwhelming and so deliberately designed that it preempted the viewer's ability to see past it to whatever was underneath. When this entire constructed reality began to collapse in. The last 2 years of the war, Göring seemed genuinely bewildered, not merely politically threatened, but existentially disoriented, as though the failure of his Germany were also, and perhaps more fundamentally, the failure of his self-conception. Several of his post-war interviewers at Nuremberg, including the American psychologist Leon Goldenson, who also conducted extensive interviews with the defendants, noted a quality in Göring's recollections of the good years, the late 30s and early 40s, that was different from nostalgia in its usual sense. It was not merely that he looked back fondly on a time when things had been better for him personally, though he certainly did that. It was that he described that period with the specificity and vividness of someone who had been fully, unreservedly alive in a way that the years since had not permitted. He described the mornings at Karinhall, the hunts, the dinners, the collecting expeditions, with a detail and a warmth that made his interrogators uncomfortable, not because he was celebrating crimes, but because the crimes were entirely absent from his account. The world he was describing, the world he had genuinely lived in and loved, was a world from which the violence and the suffering had been so completely edited out that they might never have existed. He was not dissembling exactly. He was remembering, with extraordinary fidelity, the version of his life that he had chosen to inhabit, The contrast between this private world and the public record of what was happening simultaneously in Europe was, for anyone listening to his accounts with knowledge of the context, one of the most disturbing aspects of the Nuremberg testimony. He described a hunting party at Karinhall in 1942, the cold morning air of the Schorfheide, the quality of the light through the trees, the satisfaction of a successful stag, with a vivid sensory precision that stood in absolute contrast to the fact that 1942 was the year of the Wannsee Conference, the year of the Reinhard death camps coming to full operational capacity, the year in which the systematic murder of European Jews reached its most intensive phase, a phase that Göring had authorized with his signature on a document he either understood completely or had chosen not to understand, and either answer was damning. The hunting party and the death camps were simultaneous realities in the same world, and he moved through one of them with the unhurried pleasure of a man in paradise. One of the more revealing documents in the entire record of the Third Reich is the catalogue of the Göring art collection, prepared by his staff with meticulous care and now held by various archival institutions including the Bundesarchiv in Germany. It runs to hundreds of pages and lists each work with its title, artist, period, dimensions, provenance, and the circumstances of its acquisition. The latter often recorded with a matter-of-factness that is itself a kind of horror. A Vermeer listed simply as acquired from the Goudsticker collection, Paris 1940, with the purchase price noted and the name of the dealer through whom the transaction was processed, with no mention of the fact that Jacques Goudsticker, the Dutch Jewish art dealer whose gallery it had been, had fled the German invasion of the Netherlands in May 1940, fallen through an uncovered hatch on the ship carrying him to safety, and died of a broken neck, leaving his collection to be seized by German authorities and assigned to Göring. A Cranach listed as a gift from the Reichsmarschall to his daughter Edda, with a description of the work's condition and a note about its place in the estate's hanging scheme. The catalogue was a professional document prepared by professional staff doing their professional jobs, and its tone throughout is that of any other institutional inventory: careful, precise, and completely divorced from the human history embedded in every entry. The restitution, process that began after the war and continues in modified form today, has returned hundreds of works from the Göring collection to their original owners or their heirs. The legal and diplomatic effort involved has been enormous, conducted across multiple countries and jurisdictions, and the work is still not complete. Every returned painting is a small act of justice, and every one that remains unlocated or tied up in legal dispute is a reminder of the scale of what was taken and the difficulty of undoing even a fraction of it. The catalogue, with its calm professional language, is in this sense one of the most powerful indictments of Göring's daily life that exists, more damaging in its bureaucratic precision than any number of dramatic accusations, because it reduces the theft to its component facts and leaves the reader to confront the arithmetic of what daily pleasure in beautiful things looked like when the beautiful things had been taken from people under threat of violence. And worse, his final months in American captivity before the Nuremberg trial began were marked by a physical recovery that was itself a kind of revelation. The process of withdrawing from Paracodeine, managed by American military doctors who were methodical and unsentimental about it, took several weeks of considerable physical discomfort and produced, at the end of it, a Göring who was, by most accounts, clearer in his thinking and more focused in his engagement than he had been for years. He lost weight during captivity, not to the lean figure of his youth, but to something more moderate than the wartime maximum. He slept on a regular schedule, imposed by prison routine rather than by his own inclination. He ate regular meals of standard prison quality, rather than the elaborate productions of his household kitchen. The external apparatus of his daily performance was stripped away entirely, and what remained was, it turned out, formidable. This is perhaps the most disturbing fact in the entire story of what Hermann Göring actually did all day. The version of him that emerged from captivity, focused, clear-headed, intellectually engaged, and capable of running rings around Robert Jackson in cross-examination, was arguably the most effective version of Hermann Göring that ever existed. And that version appeared only after everything that had made his daily life exceptional. The art, the trains, the costumes, the drugs, the grandeur, the power, had been taken away, which suggests that all of it, every elaborate element of the daily routine he had constructed over 30 years, had been not an expression of his best self, but a sustained project of avoiding it. let us return to an area that deserves considerably more attention than the broad outline of his daily life can accommodate, which is the specific texture of Göring's relationship with the men and women of his household and personal staff, because this relationship illuminates the way power operated in his personal sphere in ways that are genuinely instructive. Robert Kropp, his personal valet, stayed with him for years, and his accounts of the daily routine have been invaluable to historians trying to reconstruct the reality of life at Karinhall. Kropp was responsible for laying out the day's costumes, preparing the bath, ensuring that the Reichsmarschall's morning routines proceeded without friction. His descriptions of the care with which Göring selected his clothing for the day, consulting options laid out by Kropp with the focused attention of a collector examining a new acquisition, provide some of the most intimate and revealing portraits of the man available. He was not careless about his appearance in the way of a man indifferent to how he looked. He was obsessively, meticulously careful about it. He changed his rings depending on which outfit he was wearing. He had a collection of decorations, orders and medals so extensive that choosing which to wear required real decision-making. He varied the combination based on who he was seeing, what message he wanted to convey, what theatrical effect he was pursuing. A morning meeting with Luftwaffe generals called for one configuration, a diplomatic reception for another, an afternoon hunt called for the elaborate green hunting outfit and the ornamental weapons. An evening dinner might call for the full theatrical splendour of the Reichsmarschall's uniform with the golden baton. The staff at Karinhall numbered in the dozens and included chefs, housekeeping staff, gardeners, gamekeepers, mechanics for the vehicles and aircraft, security personnel, and a rotating complement of military and administrative adjutants. Managing this household was a significant enterprise in its own right, and Emmy Goering, in her quiet and efficient way, was its primary manager. She handled the staff relationships, the domestic scheduling, the planning of the elaborate dinners and receptions that Göring hosted throughout the war years. She did this, by most accounts, with genuine skill and without the petulance and tyranny that characterized the domestic management of some other senior Nazi figures. The staff appear, in the accounts that survive, to have liked her considerably more than they were awed or afraid of her husband. He was the theatrical, unpredictable centre of the household, demanding and generous by turns, prone to sudden enthusiasms that required immediate reorganisation of everyone's plans, capable of extraordinary warmth one day and bewildering coldness the next, particularly as the drugs took hold more firmly and the military situation grew more dire. Emmy was the steady centre of gravity around which the household actually organised itself. The dinners at Karinhall deserve more detailed attention than we have so far given them, because they were, for much of the war, a genuine centre of Nazi social and political life, and the conversations that took place over Göring's table illuminate the intellectual and moral atmosphere of the regime in ways that purely official accounts cannot. Göring was at his best at the dinner table. His intelligence, which was genuine and considerable, was most fully deployed in conversation rather than in administration or command. He could discuss art with genuine expertise and engage visiting curators or dealers in real technical discussions about provenance, attribution, and restoration. He could discuss aviation history and technology with the informed passion of someone who had lived it personally and continued to follow it obsessively. He could tell stories about the First World War, about the early days of the Nazi movement, about the political struggles of the 1930s that were genuinely compelling and frequently funny, even if they were also frequently self-aggrandizing and occasionally counterfactual. He was a man who had been present at some of the most dramatic moments in 20th century German history and who understood the storytelling value of that presence and deployed it with skill. Foreign dignitaries who attended these evenings were often surprised and sometimes uncomfortably charmed. The Hungarian regent Miklos Horthy attended a hunting party and dinner at Karinhall in 1938 and left a description in his memoirs that conveys both the seductiveness and the underlying unease of the experience. He described the extraordinary natural beauty of the Schorfheide forest, the lavishness of the hunting lodge, the quality of the food and wine, and Göring's personal warmth as a host, before noting, with the dry understatement of a man who had himself navigated complicated political terrain, that certain subjects were conspicuously not discussed over dinner. This was a consistent feature of the Karinhall evenings. The conversations were brilliant and wide-ranging and scrupulously avoided certain topics. The camps, the systematic persecution of Jews, the specific mechanics of occupation policy, the numbers. These things happened elsewhere and were discussed elsewhere by other people, and Karinhall was a place where the magnificent surface of the regime was on display and its foundations were not examined. This was not accidental. It was a deliberate construction, and Göring was its architect and its primary beneficiary. His relationship with other senior Nazi figures was complex and often hostile beneath the surface of collegial cooperation that the regime's public face required. Joseph Goebbels, the Reich Minister of Propaganda, despised Göring with a venom that was partially ideological and partially personal. Goebbels, who was fastidious about his own appearance despite his small stature and physical disability, found Göring's theatrical excess vulgar. He recorded in his diaries numerous contemptuous assessments of the Reichsmarschall, the obesity, the drug use, the self-indulgence, the catastrophic failures of the Luftwaffe, the transparent vanity that led him to wear costumes no professional officer would have tolerated. Göring, for his part, regarded Goebbels with the specific contempt that large men sometimes reserve for small, clever ones, dismissing his propaganda schemes as the work of someone who dealt in words because he couldn't handle the reality of power and war. This mutual contempt was kept within manageable limits by their shared dependency on Hitler's favour, but it was a genuine and persistent feature of the regime's internal dynamics, and occasionally leaked into the open in ways that complicated coordination between the propaganda ministry and the air ministry. His relationship with Heinrich Himmler was more guarded and more dangerous for both parties. Himmler was, by the mid-years of the war, arguably the second most powerful figure in the Reich after Hitler himself, and certainly the figure with the most direct control over the machinery of repression and genocide. Göring and Himmler had originally been rivals for influence in the early years of the regime, most visibly over the question of who controlled the Gestapo, which Göring had created, and which Himmler eventually absorbed into his SS empire. Göring lost this fight in 1934, and the loss marked a significant erosion of his political power in the domestic security sphere, even as he retained his aviation and economic roles. After the transfer, the relationship between the two men settled into a chilly professional coexistence, punctuated by occasional turf battles and mutual backstabbing. Göring privately referred to Himmler as a man whose power rested on the possession of secrets about everyone, including himself, which was broadly accurate and which he regarded as both dangerous and contemptible. Himmler regarded Göring's lifestyle and habits with the prim disapproval of an ideological Puritan. The drug use, the excess, the theatrical self-indulgence, all of it offended Himmler's ascetic sensibility, and he filed the information away, in the way he filed everything away as potential leverage to be used if necessary. Albert Speer, the architect and later armaments minister, whom Hitler favoured enormously in the Middle War years, had a more complicated and in some ways more interesting relationship with Göring. Speer respected Göring's ability to get things done in the early years of rearmament, the organisational energy he had shown in building the Luftwaffe, the genuine administrative competence he had displayed in running the 4-year plan, when he was still sufficiently motivated and sufficiently sober to do so. But Speer also observed the deterioration with clinical clarity, and his post-war memoirs, Inside the Third Reich, contain some of the most precisely observed and most damning descriptions of Göring's declining years available anywhere. Speer described visiting Göring in the later war years and finding him surrounded by his art, preoccupied with the model railway, discussing the latest acquisitions, while the factories that should have been producing aircraft were being destroyed by Allied bombing raids. He described the meetings at which Göring would make sweeping promises about Luftwaffe production figures that bore no relation to what the factories were actually capable of delivering, and the exhausted resignation of the technical staff who had long since stopped trying to correct him. He described the curious dignity that Göring could still occasionally summon, the flashes of genuine intelligence and even wisdom that made his overall failure more tragic and more infuriating than simple incompetence would have been. The man had the capabilities. He simply had not the character. The specific question of Göring's relationship with the Luftwaffe's technical and production side is worth examining in some detail, because it illuminates a dimension of his daily work that is often overlooked in favour of the more colourful aspects of his personal life. The Luftwaffe's aircraft production and development programme was, throughout most of the war, a source of genuine difficulty and frustration for everyone involved, including Göring himself, though his frustration was often directed at his subordinates rather than at the root causes of the problems, which were partly systemic and partly of his own making. Germany began the war with an excellent fighter in the Messerschmitt Bf 109 and a range of competent, if not exceptional, bombers. The problem was that the Luftwaffe's design and production pipeline, while efficient in producing large quantities of existing types, was poorly organized for the rapid development and introduction of next-generation aircraft. The structures that should have been managing this process were fragmented, overlapping, and subject to constant political interference from Göring's office and from Hitler's headquarters. Promising designs were delayed by bureaucratic infighting. Innovative engineers were frustrated by constant redirection, as Göring's enthusiasms shifted from one project to another. The result was a service that entered the critical years of 1942 and 1943, with aircraft types that were increasingly outmatched by their Soviet and Anglo-American counterparts and with a development pipeline that could not produce replacements fast enough. Göring's interventions in this process were characteristically mixed. On some questions, he was right. He had supported the development of the Focke-Wulf FW-190, which entered service in 1941 and proved to be a genuinely excellent fighter that gave the RAF real problems over France and the Low Countries. He had championed the development of long-range aircraft in the pre-war period, though this program was later cancelled under circumstances that remain disputed. He had maintained genuine enthusiasm for the Me-262 jet, visiting the development facilities and pressing for accelerated production, though this enthusiasm was ultimately subverted by the broader political and strategic confusion over how the aircraft should be used. On other questions, he was disastrously wrong. His insistence that German bomber doctrine should prioritize dive bombing, an enthusiasm that delayed the development of heavier strategic bombers in the critical pre-war years, left Germany without a serious four-engine heavy bomber throughout the war, a gap that had significant consequences for the campaign against Britain and Soviet industry. His acceptance of Hermann Udet's optimistic production promises, which were based on falsified figures, led to a serious miscalculation of Luftwaffe strength at the beginning of the war in the Soviet Union. Udet, a former flying ace whom Göring had appointed to head aircraft procurement, partly on the basis of their shared First World War history, and partly because Udet was cheerful, non-threatening, and reliably optimistic, killed himself in November 1941 when the scale of the falsifications became unsustainable. Göring gave him a state, funeral, and a heroic public narrative that bore no relation to the facts because acknowledging what had actually happened would have meant acknowledging his own failure of oversight. The role of personal loyalty and personal history in Göring's command decisions is a thread worth following because it explains some of his worst choices. He had a tendency to appoint men he liked personally, men from his World War I circle, men who told him what he wanted to hear, men who were entertaining company and confirmed his sense of himself as a great man, to positions that required qualities entirely different from those that made them enjoyable dinner companions. Hans Jeschonek, his chief of the Luftwaffe General Staff from 1939 to 1943, was a capable officer who was nevertheless overwhelmed by the demands of the position, and who, like Udet, eventually took his own life rather than face the consequences of Göring's impossible promises and the Luftwaffe's cascading failures. He shot himself on August 18, 1943, after the catastrophic Peenemünde raid the previous night in which the RAF bombed Germany's rocket development facilities and inflicted significant damage. Göring's response to Jeschonek's death was, characteristically, to try to minimize the public damage. The official announcement listed the cause of death as a stomach ailment. Nobody who knew anything believed this, but nobody said so publicly because nobody with relevant knowledge had either the inclination or the safety to do so. Let us also spend some time on the specific mechanics of the art theft operation, because it was not merely a sideline to Göring's daily life, but one of its most thoroughly organized and time-consuming aspects, and because the scale and systematic nature of what he did has had consequences that continue to reverberate in museums and courtrooms and diplomatic negotiations decades after his death. The Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, the ERR, was nominally under the authority of Alfred Rosenberg, the NSDAP's chief ideologist, but in practice functioned largely to serve Göring's collecting interests, at least in the early and most intensive period of its operation. The ERR was established in France shortly after the German occupation in 1940 and immediately began the systematic seizure of art and cultural objects from Jewish-owned collections, galleries, and private homes. It worked with a methodical efficiency that would have been impressive in any other context, cataloguing thousands of objects with precise descriptions, photographs, and provenance records, then sorting them according to their designated destination. Hitler had priority access to anything he chose. Göring was second. The remaining items were distributed to other institutions or individuals, sold or, in some cases, destroyed as degenerate. Göring personally visited Paris 4 times to inspect and select from ERR holdings. These visits were conducted with the mixture of royal, progress and military efficiency that characterized his public appearances. He travelled by private train, was met by SS security and Luftwaffe honour guards, was taken to the Jeu de Paume Museum where the ERR had established its main sorting facility, and spent hours moving through the catalogued collections, choosing what he wanted with the focused, expert eye of a genuine collector. He dealt with the dealers and curators who facilitated the forced sales and confiscations with a personal charm that made the coercion behind the transactions almost invisible. Almost, unless you knew that the alternative to selling at Göring's offered price was losing the work entirely and potentially considerably worse. The dealers knew, the curators knew, the gallery owners who had fled France knew, from wherever they were, that their collections were being methodically stripped. One particularly well-documented case involves the Rothschild family collections, some of the finest private art holdings in Europe, which were seized in their entirety by German forces, and from which Göring selected numerous works for his personal collection. The restitution of these works took decades of legal effort and is still not entirely complete. After each Paris visit, the chosen works were shipped to Karinhall by rail under heavy guard. Their arrival was an event in the household, the crates being opened with the care and ceremony appropriate to receiving precious and fragile things, the works being examined, commented upon, assigned to their places in the estate's growing galleries. Göring knew the works by name and by history. He could discuss their attributions, their condition, the circumstances of their acquisition with the fluency of a professional. He read art historical literature, he corresponded with curators and scholars, he was, in the technical sense, a connoisseur, and the obscenity of what he was doing was all the more complete for being carried out with such genuine knowledge and care. By 1944, the Göring collection included approximately 1,300 significant works, in addition to medieval objects, tapestries, sculptures, and decorative items that brought the total to something approaching 1,500 individual pieces. Among them were works by Rembrandt, Vermeer, Lucas Cranach the Elder, Van Dyck, Tintoretto, Rubens, Boucher, Fragonard, and dozens of other masters. The collection, at contemporary valuations, would be worth several billion euros. At the time, much of it had been acquired for nothing or for sums so far below market value as to constitute theft by any meaningful standard. The question that his prosecutors at Nuremberg pressed on him, and that he struggled more than anywhere else to answer convincingly, was whether he had known that the works were being stolen from people who had no choice but to surrender them. His defence was that he had gone through proper purchase procedures, that prices had been paid, that the transactions had been legal under the laws applicable at the time. The prosecution's response was that the applicable laws had been designed specifically to strip Jews and other targeted groups of their property under threat of violence, and that participating in such a system with full knowledge of its coercive character was not different in moral or legal terms from theft. Göring was never fully able to refute this argument, and the exhibit dealing with the art looting, with its meticulous ERR documentation of what had been taken from whom and for what price or for nothing, was one of the most damaging sections of the prosecution's case against him. After the war, the restitution process for works from Göring's collection proved lengthy and legally complex. Some works were recovered relatively quickly by Allied forces, who found them in the salt mines and storage facilities, where Göring had sent them for safety. Others had been sold or traded or given away and took years of tracing through dealers and private collections. Some have never been recovered. the Cranach painting of the Madonna and Child that Göring gave to his daughter Edda as a childhood present, became, as the Children of Nazi Leaders video described, the subject of legal disputes that she mostly lost when German courts ruled in the 1960s that the works could not be considered legitimate personal property given the circumstances of their acquisition. This ruling, and the court proceedings that surrounded it, forced Edda Göring into one of the few public confrontations with her father's legacy that her private life had otherwise allowed her to avoid. The art, ultimately, couldn't be separated from the man who had stolen it, and the daughter could not be fully separated from the father who had given it to her. The physical decline of Hermann Göring over the course of the war is itself a kind of visual narrative of the regime's trajectory, and it deserves a moment's attention. Because it was not merely a personal medical story, but a public political fact that shaped how the German people perceived both him and the war he was supposedly helping to win. In 1939, at 56, no, at 46, at the outbreak of war, he was heavy but recognizable as the decorated veteran, the man of action, the powerful figure the Nazi propaganda had been presenting to the German public for years. By 1942, the transformation was dramatic. The weight gain, driven by the combination of his prodigious appetite and the metabolic effects of long-term opioid use, had become impossible to manage or conceal. His uniforms had been repeatedly expanded and redesigned. His face had taken on the characteristic puffiness of a man whose system was fighting a chemical imbalance it could not resolve. His movements were slow, his energy intermittent. The contrast with the young, lean fighter race in photographs from 1918 was so stark that it was almost impossible to credit the two images as depicting the same person, and yet the personal mythology, the identity as warrior and hero, remained absolutely central to how Göring understood himself, even as the body that had carried that warrior identity became an emblem of its opposite. His physicians struggled with this problem throughout the war. Dr. Ondarza, his personal doctor for much of the conflict, was placed in the impossible position of serving a patient whose primary addiction was also his primary coping mechanism, and who had both the rank and the temperament to refuse treatment he did not want. Attempts to reduce his paracodeine dosage were resisted with the full authority of his position. When he was feeling better, he was more amenable to reducing consumption. When he was feeling worse, under more stress, facing more military criticism, the consumption increased and any reduction efforts were abandoned. The weight loss that sometimes accompanied his better periods was reversed during the worse ones. His sleep patterns, never regular, became increasingly chaotic. Some of his adjutants in the later war years described a man who seemed to be asleep more than awake, who would fall into deep slumber in the middle of briefings and then awake and demand an explanation of what had been decided in his absence, as though his sleep were itself a command decision that others were obliged to work around. There is one final dimension of Göring's daily life that is rarely discussed in the standard accounts, but that deserves inclusion here, which is his relationship with humour, his own and other people's. He was genuinely a funny man, and he knew it and used it deliberately. His humour was the humour of someone who had spent decades in military messes and diplomatic receptions and political intrigue, broad, often coarse, frequently at someone else's expense, but delivered with timing and confidence that made it land effectively. He told stories against himself occasionally, which was a technique for controlling the narrative around his reputation rather than genuine self-deprecation, but which had the effect of making him seem more approachable and more self-aware than he actually was. He made jokes about his weight that forestalled, for a time, the cutting jokes others were making about it. He deflected serious criticism with humour in ways that his prosecutors at Nuremberg found genuinely difficult to counter, because every time they drove home a point, he found a way to slip out from under its full weight with a quip or a rhetorical manoeuvre that shifted the focus. Gustav Gilbert's Nuremberg diary records one exchange in which Göring, confronted with a particularly damning piece of documentary evidence, smiled and said something to the effect that if he had known he would need to account for his paperwork so carefully, he would have been more attentive to what he signed. It was funny, in a dark way. It was also chilling. Gilbert noted that the other defendants frequently turned to Göring at difficult moments in the proceedings, not because he was their leader in any formal sense, but because he was the one most capable of finding, or at least performing, a lightness in the proceedings that made the enormity of what they were being tried for temporarily bearable. His performance at Nuremberg was, in a sense, the final, fullest expression of the theatrical genius that had defined his public life since the 1920s. He was in that courtroom without the costumes and the art and the model trains and the drugs, stripped of everything external and performing on pure intelligence and presence. And the performance was genuinely remarkable, even if its ultimate purpose was self-exculpation in the face of overwhelming evidence of crimes for which no exculpation was possible. The cyanide capsule was the final curtain, and it fell with the same dramatic timing that had characterized his best performances, at the last possible moment, denying the court's jurisdiction over his death just as he had spent the trial attempting to deny its jurisdiction over his life. Whether this represented courage or cowardice, defiance or despair, is a question that different people have answered differently, and the answer probably depends on what you think courage and cowardice actually require. What we are left with, surveying the full arc of Hermann Göring's daily existence from the theatrical mornings at Karinhall to the stripped simplicity of the Nuremberg cell, is a portrait of a man who was, in the most unsettling possible way, completely himself throughout. He was always a performer, always an accumulator, always a man whose sense of self required external magnificence to feel real. He was always a man whose genuine intelligence and genuine talents were consistently subordinated to his vanity and his appetites. He was always, in the most literal sense, a man who preferred the beautiful surface to whatever lay beneath it, who chose the painting over the person who owned it, the model train over the real train carrying real people to real destinations, the theatrical uniform over the honest acknowledgement of what the uniform represented. The Holocaust was happening. The war was destroying Europe. The men of his Luftwaffe were dying in the air and on the frozen ground, and Hermann Göring was in his train room, running his model railways in the quiet of a Prussian afternoon. Perfectly content, completely insulated, entirely himself. The telegram that Göring sent to Hitler on April 23, 1945, was based on an interpretation of a 1941 decree in which Hitler had designated Göring as his successor if he became incapacitated or unable to function as Führer. With Berlin surrounded and Hitler apparently resolved to die in the bunker, Göring reasoned with the curious, tortured logic of a man who had spent 2 decades thinking about the Nazi succession that the time had come for him to assume command. He asked Hitler to confirm that the succession clause was now operative, and he named a specific time, 10 in the evening of April 23rd, by which he would assume authority if he received no contrary instruction. He framed the telegram with elaborate deference, assuring Hitler of his undying loyalty and noting that he understood if Hitler wished to remain in Berlin until the end. It was, by any objective measure, an extraordinary document to send to a man who was sitting in a bunker under a city being shelled by Soviet artillery. A man whose mental state had been deteriorating for months, a man whose inner circle had been systematically poisoning his opinion of Göring for years, and a man who had been recently informed by that same inner circle that similar succession-related moves by senior Nazis constituted treasonous disloyalty. The telegram landed in the bunker and was immediately seized upon by Martin Bormann as the evidence he had been waiting for. Bormann presented it to Hitler not as a clumsy and politically naive attempt at an orderly succession, but as a treasonous coup attempt, and Hitler, in his bunker state, believed him. He flew into a rage. He ordered Göring's arrest. He stripped him of all his offices and ranks. He declared that but for Göring's past services to the movement, he would have been shot. The SS troops at Obersalzberg placed Göring and his family under house arrest. He sat in his mountain retreat, stripped of his titles and his authority, and surrounded by armed SS guards, while what remained of the Third Reich collapsed around him. Berlin fell on May 2, 1945. Hitler was dead in the bunker, having shot himself on April 30th. Goebbels and his wife murdered their children and themselves. The German armies on all fronts were surrendering or collapsing. On May 6, 1945, Göring dismissed his SS Guard, made contact with American military units, and surrendered himself to General Karl Spaatz, the commander of the United States Strategic Air Forces in Europe. He went to the Americans rather than the Soviets deliberately, calculating, not unreasonably, that his chances were better with an enemy that operated according to rule of law than with an army whose occupied territories he had helped to devastate. He arrived at American headquarters with his substantial household, his valet, Emmy, Edda, and an enormous quantity of luggage, including, according to multiple accounts, a suitcase full of paracodeine pills and a supply of the special white pills that helped him manage the most acute phases of his withdrawal symptoms. The first thing American doctors did was begin the process of weaning him off the opioids, a process that would take months and that was, by all accounts, deeply unpleasant for everyone concerned. What is remarkable about Göring's surrender and his subsequent behavior in American captivity is the degree to which it represented a kind of character revelation, a last opportunity for the real Hermann Göring to show himself before the judgment of history. In captivity, without the drugs, without the costumes, without the art and the trains and the elaborate dinners, stripped of everything except his intelligence and his willingness to perform, Göring was, by universal account, far more impressive than anyone had expected. He was cooperative with his interrogators. He was articulate, knowledgeable, and, within limits, honest about what had happened. He was willing to discuss the military operations of the war with a frankness and analytical clarity that surprised the intelligence officers debriefing him. Men who had expected to find a buffoon and instead found someone who could discuss air strategy, logistics, and the failures of German military planning with genuine expertise. American interrogators, including the psychologist Gustav Gilbert, who conducted extensive interviews with the Nuremberg defendants and wrote about them in his book Nuremberg Diary, described Göring as the most intellectually formidable of all the defendants, which is saying something given that the group included Hess, Ribbentrop, Keitel, Jodl, and others who were far from stupid men. Gilbert measured his IQ at 138. He was perceptive, strategic in his thinking, and disturbingly capable of presenting his own crimes in a light that made them seem like the regrettable necessities of a war he had not chosen and a regime whose worst excesses he had not controlled. He was lying, of course, as his prosecutors were able to demonstrate, but he was doing it brilliantly. The International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg began its proceedings on November 20th, 1945, with 21 major defendants in the dock. Göring was the most prominent of them, listed first on the indictment, seated at the front of the defendant's box, and treated from the first day of the proceedings as the de facto leader of the group. He seemed to relish the role, which was consistent with everything we know about him. Here, finally, was a stage worthy of his talents, an international court, the press of the entire world, the judges of 4 allied nations, and he, Hermann Göring, as the central figure. He dressed carefully, if soberly, for the proceedings, his uniform stripped of insignia, as required. He was attentive, taking extensive notes, engaging with the proceedings with a focused seriousness that contrasted sharply with the dissociated, drug-hazed inattention of his later war years. He was, in the courtroom, the most coherent version of himself, and it was both deeply impressive and deeply troubling to observe. His cross-examination by the American chief prosecutor, Robert Jackson, became one of the most famous legal confrontations of the 20th century. Jackson, a brilliant lawyer and former United States Attorney General, had prepared extensively, and his approach was to methodically demonstrate Göring's direct involvement in the crimes charged. Göring, however, refused to be methodically demolished. He answered each question with counter-questions, qualifications, and historical context that turned Jackson's carefully constructed examination into something more resembling a debate between equals, with Göring often appearing to have the better of the exchanges. He was not denying his actions exactly. He was recontextualizing them, situating them within the logic of a war that he characterized as a defensive struggle for German survival and national honor, with himself as a professional soldier and statesman doing what the circumstances required. He was charming. He was occasionally even funny. Several observers noted that if you did not know what he was actually being tried for, you might, in certain moments, almost like him. The British and Soviet prosecutors handled him more effectively, in part because they were less emotionally invested in winning the rhetorical exchange and more focused on building the documentary record. The evidence was overwhelming. The signed orders, the testimony of survivors, the captured files of the ERR documenting every stolen painting, the authorization he had given Heydrich for the final solution, the commando orders, the testimony about the treatment of Soviet prisoners of war. Göring's defences, however ingenious and however well delivered, could not account for documents bearing his signature and seals. He had not, it turned out, been quite as careful a criminal as he might have been, but then again, in 1941 and 1942, he had not expected to be sitting in a Nuremberg courtroom being asked to account for his signature. He had expected to be in Karinhall, surrounded by his art, presiding over a victorious Greater German Reich with the Reichsmarschall stab on his desk and the model trains running in the next room. The verdict, delivered on October 1st, 1946, found Göring guilty on all 4 counts of the indictment. The sentence was death by hanging. There is a particular cruelty in this for Göring, not because the verdict was unjust, but because the method of execution was one that, as a former military officer, he found deeply humiliating. Military men faced firing squads, criminals were hanged. He immediately petitioned to be shot rather than hanged, a request that was denied. He then settled into the last days of his life with the focus and composure that had characterized his performance throughout the trial, and he began to plan his final act. Where the cyanide capsule came from is one of the enduring mysteries of the Nuremberg proceedings. Multiple investigations were conducted, both at the time and in subsequent decades, into how a man held in maximum security with constant Allied Guard supervision managed to retain or obtain a small glass ampule of potassium cyanide sufficient to kill himself. The theories range from an American guard who may have been sympathetic, to a final visit from his wife that was inadequately supervised, to a capsule he had concealed in his body since his surrender. The post-war investigation concluded inconclusively. What is known is that on the evening of October 15, 1946, the night before his scheduled execution, Hermann Göring bit down on a cyanide capsule in his Nuremberg prison cell and died within minutes. He was 53 years old. The other condemned defendants were hanged the following day. Their bodies, including Göring's, were cremated, and the ashes were scattered in the Isar River, a deliberate decision by the Allied authorities to ensure that no grave existed that could become a shrine. There would be no Karinhall for the dead. There would be no mausoleum, no bronze marker, no landscaped memorial in a quiet Prussian forest, just ashes in a river and the historical record. In the decades that followed, the question of how to assess Hermann Göring acquired layers of complexity that still have not entirely resolved themselves. He was not, by the standards of the worst of the Nazi criminals, a figure of clinical sadism or ideological genocide in the way that Himmler or Heydrich were. He was not a bureaucrat of death like Adolf Eichmann, who organized transportation to the extermination camps with the focused efficiency of a railway scheduler. He was not an experimenter, not a direct killer, not someone who drew satisfaction from the specific mechanics of mass murder. And yet, through his political position, his signatures, his authorizations, his willing participation in the institutions of the Nazi state, he was complicit in crimes of staggering magnitude, and the comfort with which he conducted his daily life throughout the years in which those crimes were being committed is one of the most searing indictments of the entire story. The model trains running while the real trains carried people to Auschwitz. The stolen Rembrandt hanging while the Jewish families from whose walls it had been taken were dying in camps. The elaborate costumes and theatrical dinners while the men of his Luftwaffe froze to death in winter airfields. The whole story of what Hermann Göring did all day is, at its core, the story of a man who used the resources and pleasures of civilization to insulate himself from the consequences of having helped destroy it. His daughter Edda lived a quiet life after the war, as the children of Nazi leaders video recounted. She was born in 1938 and spent her early childhood in the extraordinary splendor of Karinhall. Photographed at public events as a symbol of Nazi family values, given historic artworks as birthday presents, growing up in a world of privilege and beauty that had been constructed on foundations of theft and terror. After the war, the artworks she had been given as a child became the subject of lengthy legal disputes that she mostly lost. She maintained privately that her father had been a good man, a statement that requires either a profound moral confusion or a depth of personal loyalty that defeats ordinary judgment. She died in 2018, the last living. Linked to the domestic life of Karinhall, to the model trains and the hunting parties and the theatrical dinners. What she made of the full historical record about her father is not known. What she felt about the gap between the man who read to her in the evenings and the man whose signature appears on the authorization for the final solution is not recorded. These are questions that the children of perpetrators are rarely able to answer, and rarely perhaps should be asked. The Karinhall estate itself was destroyed. In April 1945, as Soviet forces advanced, Göring ordered the buildings demolished rather than allow them to fall intact to the enemy. His staff used explosives and incendiaries to bring down the rooms he had built and filled over a decade, the galleries and the swimming pool and the cinema and presumably the train room. The mausoleum containing Karin's remains was also destroyed, though her body was eventually recovered and reinterred in Sweden. The forests of the Schorfheide grew back over the ruins, and today there is very little visible trace of the palace that once stood there. A hunting lodge, a few scattered stoneworks, the ghost of a foundation here and there in the trees. The bison that Göring introduced to the forest, however, survived, and their descendants still roam the Schorfheide Nature Reserve, which is now a protected area. This small, inadvertent legacy, wild animals living where a palace once stood, is perhaps the most appropriate memorial to a man whose daily life was always, at some level, a performance of power and splendour that obscured the wreckage it was built upon. It is worth considering, before we conclude, the larger historical context in which Göring's story sits, because his daily life was not merely the story of an individual's excess and failure, but a window into the nature of the system that produced him. The Nazi state created conditions in which men like Göring could thrive precisely because it valued loyalty, theatrical display, and the performance of confidence over competence, expertise, and honest reporting. The mechanisms that should have corrected his failures, professional oversight, honest intelligence assessments, accountability for broken promises, were systematically undermined by a political culture in which telling powerful men what they wanted to hear was rewarded, and telling them what was true was dangerous. Göring's morning briefings were shaped by the knowledge of everyone around him that the Reichsmarschall did not welcome difficult information. His staff selected and filtered what they presented based not on what was important, but on what he would tolerate. This is not unusual in authoritarian systems, and it is one of the central mechanisms by which authoritarian states defeat themselves. The information that might have saved them cannot reach the people at the top, because those people have made it too costly to deliver. Germany's other senior commanders viewed Göring with a mixture of contempt, fear, and grudging acknowledgement of his surviving political influence. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, one of the Wehrmacht's most capable operational commanders, reportedly referred to Göring in private with an epithet whose politeness cannot be rendered here, but whose meaning was clear. Erich von Manstein, perhaps the most gifted German military mind of the war, had numerous confrontations with Göring over the Luftwaffe's failure to support ground operations, and was consistently frustrated by Göring's inability to grasp the realities of combined arms warfare. Albert Kesselring, who served under Göring and whose own complex fate after the war we have covered in other videos, maintained a more careful public neutrality about his superior, but left memoirs that record the operational frustrations of working within Göring's command structure with diplomatic but evident precision. Karl Dönitz, the Grand Admiral who commanded Germany's submarine fleet and whose own post-war fate we have also examined, had relatively little direct operational contact with Göring, but shared the widespread view among senior officers that the Reichsmarschall's promises were not to be relied upon. What German generals thought of their own side's leadership was, in many cases, at least as interesting as what they thought of the Allied commanders opposing them. And Göring occupied a particular place in that internal reckoning as the most spectacular example of how the Nazi system elevated personality over professionalism. The specific question of what Hermann Göring actually did all day has an answer that is simultaneously mundane and monstrous. He rose late and bathed elaborately. He chose his costume with theatrical care. He ate a breakfast of impressive scale. He received a brief that he half attended to. He spent his afternoon with his art collection or his hunting or his model trains. He presided over his dinner with the warmth and humour of a gifted host. He took his pills and went to bed. And in the margins of all of this, the routine and the comfort and the performance, he signed the orders, authorized the operations, gave the promises, and maintained the silence that made the crimes of the Third Reich possible. The daily life of Hermann Göring is not interesting because it was unusual. It is interesting because it was, in its physical rhythms and its human appetites, so recognizable, and because that recognizability makes the moral distance between his comfortable days and their catastrophic consequences more disturbing than any amount of theatrical villainy ever could. He was not a monster who lived like a monster. He was a man who lived like a king and governed like a criminal, and the gap between those two things is where the history of the Third Reich has its most disturbing home. The legacy that Göring left behind is one of remarkable, sustained and total failure. He built the Luftwaffe from nothing and failed to win the Battle of Britain. He promised to supply Stalingrad and failed catastrophically. He promised to protect German cities from Allied bombers and failed publicly and humiliatingly, so publicly that ordinary Germans called him by a new name in the streets. He maintained his personal empire of stolen art and theatrical luxury until the armies of justice arrived to take it all away. He made his final political play in April 1945 and was stripped of everything before the ink on his telegram was dry. He tried to negotiate his way out of a death sentence at Nuremberg with the same charm and intelligence he had deployed throughout his career, and very nearly succeeded, and then denied the court's jurisdiction over his death by doing it himself. Even his final act was a performance, the last theatrical gesture of a man for whom performance had always been the primary mode of existence. In the end, what Hermann Göring actually did all day was perform. He performed power. He performed competence. He performed joy in his luxury and authority in his commands, and devotion in his friendships, and love in his family. And when the performance was finally, irreversibly over, and the set had been demolished, and the costumes burned, and the trains dismantled, and the art dispersed, what remained was the historical record of what the performance had cost, in lives and in civilization, and in the simple, irreducible weight of human suffering. A cost that no amount of theatrical genius can ever sufficiently account for, and that no passage of time has been sufficient to discharge. Well, that's it for today. Thanks for watching, and we hope you found this deep dive into the extraordinary and troubling daily life of Hermann Göring as illuminating as we found it to research and write. If you enjoyed this video and want to know more about the key figures of the Third Reich, make sure you check out our other videos, including what happened to Germany's top field marshals after World War II, what happened to Germany's generals after World War II, where did the Waffen-SS go after 1945, what happened to the wives of Nazi leaders after World War II, and what happened to the children of Nazi leaders after World War II. All of those videos are available on our channel right now. If you found today's video informative, please take a moment to like it and subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. We cover the full depth of World War II history, from the commanders to the common soldier, from the political architects to the families they left behind, from the battles to the trials and everything in between. Thank you for being here, and we will see you in the next one.